Good afternoon, everyone. I'm glad that I could be with you today to talk with you a little bit about how women won the vote. This is the year, the centennial year. We're celebrating 100 years since women won the vote here in the United States. And when I say won, I mean won. This was a battle. This was a battle that women fought for 70 years in the United States. During that time, they organized, they lobbied, there were speeches, there were marches, there were protests. The protests went all the way from local communities to the White House. In the end, it took protesting around Washington, D.C. It took women getting mad, getting in trouble, getting arrested and incarcerated. Took all of that to win this battle. And the last few years of it were happening during a pandemic, not unlike the era that we are in right now. But in 1920, finally, for white women, voting discrimination on the basis of sex came to an end when 2/3 of the states ratified the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution. Indigenous women and women of color had to wait quite a lot longer to gain their full voting rights. Now, women and men here in Lake City worked on gaining women's suffrage, and a little bit of their legacy lives on here in Lake City. So at the end of the presentation, I'm going to make some connections for you to Underwood Park, Jewel Avenue, and another to the Minnesota State Fair. But first, let me introduce you to some of the people that were involved with the battle for suffrage here in our area. And I promise I've only got a few pictures of very old people to show you. Let's see if I can get this going. First, we have Phineas Jewel, Dr. Phineas Jewel. He was born in 1829 in New York State, in upstate New York. He studied to become a medical doctor, and he served as one during the Civil War. During that time, he became ill, so ill that he wasn't able to practice medicine anymore. And he decided then to take up his other passion, which was for the nursery business, the growing of trees and shrubs and so on to sell. He had married a woman named Catherine Underwood, who was also trained as a medical doctor. And she practiced medicine, but she became ill. She caught some disease from taking care of her patients. And they made a decision as a couple to try to find a place where they could live and maybe regain her health. And that brought them west. They were in Michigan at the time. They headed west into the new state of Minnesota. They looked around for about a year, and then they found Lake City. And once they saw Lake Pepin, they were smitten and decided that this was the place they were going to establish their nursery. Now, the idea was that they'd have someone run the nursery and that they would travel around the countryside selling all these things that they grew. So they needed someone to do that. They sent to Illinois and persuaded Catherine's brother, Joseph Merritt Underwood, who you see on the right. They persuaded him to come to Lake City to operate this nursery, and he did. He was a single man, a young man. A few years after he moved here, he met and married Anna Sargent of Winona. So she too came to live in Lake City. The doctors Jewel both died when they were relatively young, whereas the Underwoods, this couple, lived to quite an old age, were very active in the Lake City community. Besides operating the nursery, he was the vice president of the Lake City State Bank for several decades. Now, there's one other name you're going to hear me mention in the presentation, and that is Harriet Sargent. Harriet Sargent eventually moved to Lake City. and lived with her daughter. She too was involved very much in suffrage, but I don't have a picture of her. The Underwoods became wealthy from their work with the nursery business. They lived in this mansion that was built on a hill, not at the top of the bluff, but on a hill on the other side of the railroad tracks on their nursery property. Unfortunately, we don't have this mansion anymore in Lake City. It was torn down in the 1930s or the 1940s. The Underwoods were particularly good business people. They also were hardworking in the field. Anna ran the apple orchard part of the nursery business. And here we see her in one of the, there's very few photos that we have of her. This is one of them. Here she is with the apple picking crew. And it is my favorite picture of her because if you take a look under her skirt, you can see that she is wearing trousers and work boots. She was a hands-on orchardist at that time. So let's talk a little bit about how the suffrage battle was waged here in Minnesota. All of the people that you've met so far were born and lived at least the first part of their life in New York State, in upstate New York. And that is where a number of social movements were going on. There were a lot of people who practiced the Quaker religion in that area, including the Underwood family. And they were very much interested in abolition, temperance, and suffrage. Abolition, the abolishing slavery. Of course, they worked on that through the Civil War. And temperance, the regulation of liquor, which was a huge problem across the United States at that time. And then also women's suffrage. So that was part of their experience as young people. And of course, as they grew up and moved here to Minnesota, they kept in touch with those issues and in fact became active in those issues. It was in upstate New York, very near where they grew up, that the first women's rights convention was held. Seneca Falls, New York, in July of 1848. Here in Minnesota, we started talking about giving women the vote almost as soon as we became a state. It was a slow start, but in 1858, we have a record of what was probably the very first public speech given in Minnesota, advocating for votes for women. And a few years later, the very first petition was organized and sent up to the Minnesota legislature, asking for the right to vote for women. And then every year in the legislature, it was discussed. Mostly people were advocating to have the word male struck from that part of our Constitution that described who was able to vote. So now we're up to 1868. And in 1868, an important thing happened nationally that affected suffrage. For the most part, it was men and women in the northern United States and also in the expanding Midwest who were interested in suffrage, not people in the South so much. But in 1868, the 14th Amendment to the US Constitution was adopted, and that granted citizenship to all persons born or naturalized in the United States. So in other words, not just white people, but also people of color, as long as they were male. It specified that one had to be male to qualify for voting. And that was important because for women in the South, it was one thing to let the white men do the messy work of politics, but it was entirely another to have white men and men of color making decisions. Once that happened, they decided that that at least white women ought to get the right to vote as well, and that was important because that's how it brought them into the conversation about suffrage. In Back here in Minnesota, 1869, the first bill supporting votes for women was put forth in our state legislature, and it was defeated by one single vote, a vote of 22 to 21. If that had passed, we would have been the first state in the union to grant voting rights to women. But as it happens, we didn't. Wyoming won that honor. This is the same year that Phineas and Catherine Jewel settled in Lake City. It's also the same year that back in New York, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony formed the National Woman Suffrage Association. This is the first national organization that's going to work to win the vote for women. And remember Susan B. Anthony's name. That's going to come up a little bit later in the presentation. Well, they organized and sent petitions and gave speeches and hosted rallies and marches and so on in the ensuing years, but no vote for women. Here in Minnesota, while that work was going on, people were working individually trying to persuade legislatures to take some action, but there wasn't any organized group at the time. We came close another time in 1870 when the Minnesota House of Representatives passed the female suffrage bill, 33 to 13, pretty good margin. The Senate then passed the same bill, 12 to 9, and it landed on Governor Horace Austin's desk, and it sat there a few days, and he vetoed it. So the work went on. Here in Minnesota, people who were interested in temperance, the regulation of liquor, which included the Jewels and the Underwoods, that effort was pretty well organized. And it was the people working on that emerged as leaders in suffrage. One of the important connections was made by a woman right upriver. Her name was Julia Nelson, and she lived in Red Wing. Very active in temperance, but she was also especially interested in suffrage, and this is the reason why. She had been married. She and her husband had a farm in the Wakuta area and a house in Red Wing, and her husband died. She was very young, still in her 20s, and there she was, a widow. She was a landowner. She got a job. She went off and taught in other parts of the country during the school year, and then returned to Minnesota to attend to her farm and her house, and she paid her property taxes, and she didn't have a vote. She had no say in governance, no say in how her tax dollars were spent. And she didn't care much for that. It was motivating for her, and she saw an opportunity. There was a temperance meeting that was going to take place in Red Wing, and she had an idea. I'm going to read to you from an article. You're going to recognize one of the names, an article that ran in this month's Minnesota History magazine. The entire magazine this month is devoted to women's suffrage, and there's a whole article in here on Julia Nelson. And here's a paragraph, and this is tells us about a temperance meeting that took place on September 1st, 1874 at Red Wing's Music Hall. It says, as the Red Wing temperance meeting convened, the trio of women knew they could count on support for woman suffrage from one critically important male delegate, Convention Chairman Phineas A. Jewel of nearby Lake City. The influential Jewel gave a short speech favoring woman suffrage, noting that the work of temperance reform could not be prosecuted to a successful end without their cooperation, their votes. So he played an important role in getting moving the conversation along here in Minnesota. The following year, finally, in Minnesota voters ratified a constitutional amendment that would allow women to vote in school elections and be elected to school boards. And that happened here in Lake City the following year. And it happened right in the place where you are at right now. For that reason, I'm going to read to you this article about the very first vote in Lake City where women were permitted to vote. Voting didn't happen the way it does now, where you register to vote and you go to the polls sometime throughout the day and you cast your ballot. For an election then, people all got together in a room. In this case, it was about 125 people all together in a room in the high school. And right then and there, they do the nominating and the voting. So under the headline, the school meeting, it reads, as noticed in our last issue, the time for holding the regular annual school election occurred on Saturday evening last at 7:30 o'clock at the old school building. The meeting was largely attended by both ladies and gentlemen, and the proceedings were both interesting and remarkable. Remarkable because it was a new sight to witness the presence of ladies at an election where they were clothed with equal rights and privileges with the bearded lords of creation. The ordinary routine of business was commenced and proceeded as usual, among which was the report of the clerk treasurer as follows, and then it put those details in there. And then it goes on. The reports were accepted and adopted when the meeting proceeded to elect members for the ensuing year. The chair appointed D.C. Estes and H. Gillette Tellers. Dr. Garrard said he came to the meeting to vote for lady members, and he hoped all present would vote with him for Mrs. George T. Gibbs, who had just been nominated. On motion, the tellers were requested to record the names as the votes were cast. Mr. Gibbs, who had been favored with the nomination, withdrew his name before the first ballot was taken. But notwithstanding this, out of the 115 votes cast, he received 29, his wife 83, and scattering 3. The announcement of the first choice, Mrs. George T. Gibbs, to fill a vacancy occasioned by the resignation of Albert Glines, created considerable excitement among our new political acquisition. The strength developed in favor of women's rights on this occasion was decidedly manifest, as they were a power within themselves. But they were willing to concede one out of the 3 new members to the gentleman. And on the second choice, in place of M.A. Baldwin, whose term expired, A.J. Fowler received 90 out of 121 votes. Mrs. J.W. Ray, 13, Miss Pember, 6, Mrs. Knight, 6, and scattering 6. The third and last was for a member in place of J.G. Richardson, who had served for 3 years. Mrs. L.S. Van Vliet, Mrs. J.W. Ray, and H.D. Stocker were nominated. And it was on this ballot that the women again displayed their strength at the polls. Mrs. L.S. Van Vliet receiving 175 of the 118 votes cast, Mr. Stocker 38, and Mrs. Ray 5. The board now consists of Mrs. George T. Gibbs, Mrs. L.S. Van Vliet, Messrs. J.E. Dowdy, S.M. Elmery, G.D. Post, and A.J. Fowler. We can expect from the new, as of the old board, a thorough administration of affairs pertaining to the public schools, and congratulate the public on their wise and judicious selection of lady members. And then, because they knew this was a historical moment, they made a record in the paper of the names of the 33 women who voted on that day, and that list includes Anna Underwood. Now let's take a look at a couple of important documents here. You heard me say that there was an effort to remove the word male from a particular part of the Minnesota State Constitution. And here is the Minnesota State Constitution as it was adopted in August of 1857, describing who it is who has the elective franchise, who is eligible to vote. Every male person of the age of 21 years or upwards, belonging to either of the following classes, who shall have resided in the United States 1 year and in this state for 4 months next, preceding any election, shall be entitled to vote at such election in the election district of which he shall at the time have been for 10 days a resident. For all officers that now are or hereafter may be elective by the people. And there were 4 classes of citizens. And remember, just males that were 21 years of age or older from these 4 classes were permitted to vote. First class was white citizens of the United States. Second class was white persons who were born in foreign countries but were naturalized citizens. Third class was persons who were of mixed white blood and Indian or indigenous blood, who had adopted the customs and habits of civilization, and that would be as described by white people at the time. And fourth was persons of Indian or indigenous blood residing in the state who had adopted the English language, adopted the habits of white people, and who went before a judge at a district court and proved that they were capable of enjoying the rights of citizenship within the state. That is where we started. That is where the men and women who worked on suffrage began. You'll notice that our Constitution did not include persons of color in any way at that time. Now, for some background, again, I'll remind you that the people who were working on the suffrage movement were also working on some other important social movements. There was a lot of work going on for abolition of slavery. This started, of course, before the Civil War. They were working on temperance, the regulation of the liquor industry, and working on suffrage. And some of that was there in the tradition of Quakers. These were issues important to them. And here in Minnesota, it was mostly white women of privilege who were working on these things. They had the time and the resources available to them to work on these topics. It was described in one history article that these were Yankee women who gave themselves a liberal arts education through club work, including through the suffrage movement. Women were organizing all sorts of clubs at that time and meeting together and doing study and so on. And in that way, they were gaining an education. But we also had here in Lake City, we had Anna Underwood working on this, and she was educated. She had a college education. She had attended the normal school down in Winona. We now know it as Winona State University, and was educated as a teacher. And in addition, the Jewels were both educated as medical doctors. Now, the work that was going on here, as I said, it was being done by individuals and small groups of people. There wasn't any statewide organized effort yet, but people here, right here in Lake City, were working on this. And I found this in the US Congressional Record. So this is off in Washington, DC. Some Lake Cityans sent a petition. And it was put forth in Congress. I present the petition of Anna B. Underwood, Harriet B. Sargent, Mary Carey Hewlett, J.M. Underwood, A.F. Wilson, C.F. Young, and others, citizens of Wabasha County, Minnesota, praying for the following amendment to the national Constitution. And that amendment reads, "The right of suffrage in the United States shall be based on citizenship and shall be regulated by Congress. And all citizens of the United States, native or naturalized, shall enjoy this right equally without any distinction of sex." Now, they didn't write that article, that provision. That was written by the women working on suffrage in New York State. It's called the Susan B. Anthony Amendment. And this petition was put forward by people all across the country in an effort to get this constitutional amendment passed. And this wording is exactly the same as what was finally adopted by Congress 39 years later. So that's the Susan B. Anthony Amendment. It was after that that women organized here in Minnesota. Julia Nelson, who you met earlier, she took the lead at a temperance meeting up in Hastings. She took a few women aside and they organized the Minnesota Woman Suffrage Association. And then from that point, there was an organized effort to lobby Congress, to have marches, protests, and so on to advance the cause of women. There was a local society organized here in Lake City in 1883, and the work went on. Again, petitions, marches, speeches, and nothing happened. There was this group, the Minnesota Women's Suffrage Association, came to Lake City in 1893. According to the newspaper, there was a meeting that was a grand success. It said, Minnesota Women's Suffrage Association holds its 13th annual meeting at 2 p.m. at the Baptist Church in Lake City. Mrs. Julia Nelson of Red Wing was president and chair, and Anna Underwood of Lake City was elected one of the 7 members of the executive committee. A few years later, one more small step for women. The Minnesota voters approved a constitutional amendment that would give women the vote on library questions. And sure enough, a few years later in 1903, we read in the graphic, voters to decide, free public library may be established. The question as to whether Lake City shall have a free public library will be determined by the voters at the municipal election on the 7th day of April. Another matter which is very important at this time is the fact that women may vote on the library question. And if the ladies exercise their right of suffrage, the library proposition will carry. And of course, we've had a library here ever since. Now, one of the ways that the women who were working on this issue, which were mostly women in the metro area and a few others like our Anna Underwood, who had the means to participate in these meetings, one of the ways they got the word out to women all across the state was through the Minnesota State Fair. That was the one event in Minnesota where people from every corner of the state came together for the several days in the summer to celebrate agriculture and art and so on and so forth. They both Anna and Joseph Merritt Underwood were very involved with the state fair, and so they knew how to take advantage of that opportunity. So they got the word out. But still, here in Minnesota and nationally, nothing really significant seemed to be happening as far as giving women the vote. And now some of these women who had been involved in this battle all these years, they're getting on in years, and a flood of young women started to get involved. These were young women who were impatient with the lack of progress in this issue. They were women who were oftentimes in the workforce. They may have filled a lot of jobs while men were off at war during World War I. They had supported the war effort, doing the work on the home front, supporting the war. And they just weren't content to have rallies and marches and speeches and petitions. And when I say marches, I mean hundreds and sometimes thousands of women marching together in cities all across the country, working for suffrage. Well, these women, including at least 2 women from Minnesota, decided to take a little more in-your-face approach. They went off to Washington, D.C., and they decided to picket directly at the White House, at the Senate, in parks and other locations in Washington, D.C. They carried banners. They were in groups. In the pictures, it looks like there's 6 to 12 people typically at these pickets or protest groups, and they didn't go away. They were right in the face of President Wilson. He had to walk past them every time he went into the White House. Every time he went out of the White House, he could actually see them from within the White House. So they stayed there day after day after day, and right into the winter. They had provocative messages on their signs. They built watchfires to help keep themselves warm, but also they burned the president's speeches and this sort of thing. It was peaceful protests, but it wasn't much appreciated, and so they were hassled by law enforcement. They found themselves arrested and incarcerated under horrible conditions, and many of them decided to protest those horrible conditions by going on hunger strikes. So then they found themselves force-fed during that experience. Well, as a result of their protesting and their persistence, they caught the attention of the public and also gained some of the sympathy of the president. The president started to soften his stance on suffrage. He recognized the women had supported the war. He maybe owed them something, and he was tired of seeing these women out picketing day after day, week after week, outside of his residence. Also, public sympathy started to sway in favor of the women. The public wasn't very pleased with what they were hearing as far as how these women were being treated and incarcerated, and that led to the Congress finally approving what would be numbered the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution. Same wording as that Susan B. Anthony amendment that you heard about 39 years earlier. Once adopted, of course, it had to go out to the states. 2/3 of the states were going to have to ratify this. Minnesota did it almost right away that same summer. And then gradually the states lined up. We were almost there. It was at the State House of the state of Tennessee. It was voted down once, and on a second vote, a young legislator who was only in his 20s, he changed his vote. He changed his vote because his mother had sent him a letter and asked him to do the right thing for women. And with his vote, the 19th Amendment to the US Constitution became law, and white women gained the right to vote. For women of color and for indigenous women, it was quite a lot longer before they gained their voting rights. And I would offer that some of that effort is still going on today. Now, I told you I'd make some connections with Lake City, and we will do that now before I conclude here. Here in Lake City, you're familiar with Underwood Park. It's over on 10th Street. It's the big park that's got the soccer fields. Well, that park is named for Anna Underwood and Joseph Merritt Underwood. Now, not only was she active in suffrage, but he was known to be a suffrage supporter as well, and that made a difference. One of the strategies these organizations used was to keep track of where there were men who were supportive of suffrage. And for Lake City, they had their list included 7 names. One of them was Joseph Merritt Underwood. So this park sits very close to, if not on, the actual land where the nursery originally started. And if you look from here up Wabasha County 5, kind of in that direction, you see the place on the hill where their mansion was located. Jewel Avenue, which goes from the lake out past the railroad tracks and across the back of this park, it's where that row of trees is back there, that is named for the Jewel Nursery, and the Jewel Nursery was named by the Underwoods in honor of Dr. Phineas Jewel, its founder. In Minnesota, we have a terrific connection up at the State Fairgrounds. As you heard me say, Joseph Merritt Underwood and Anna were both very active in the state fair. He was the president of the Ag Society for a long time and instrumental in buying the current fairgrounds. And so the main street that goes north to south in the fairgrounds is named in his honor, Underwood Street. And that's a horticultural building in the back that he was involved with. Now, Anna's contribution at the state fair, I would offer that it is just as significant and just as endearing, but the road is named just for him in this case. And then the other Minnesota connection is one that I sensed this summer as I was witnessing, protests going on here in Minnesota and in other places around the country. Here we are in a pandemic, and here we are witnessing a lot of people, and especially young people, that are coming out for peaceful protests, and initially peaceful protests anyway, speaking up for the rights of people in our community. And that reminded me a lot of the effort that went into gaining the rights for women to vote, the right for women like me to get elected to office. I served as mayor. And so to everyone who worked on this issue, I am grateful. And to you, I want to say thank you for listening in this afternoon about the history of suffrage in Minnesota and nationally.